Great, well thanks Jenny for the introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to move this podium there because I pace. Yeah, so this is kind of both a interesting topic to explore, and I think it's hopefully an important one. I think it's generally a question that many of us try to either ask or answer in some clear way. My hope in giving this talk is that hopefully we can have some tools to at least begin the conversation in a more thorough way. So if you came here for the answer to the meaning of life, you're going to be sadly disappointed. If anything, I'll maybe provide an answer, and we can hopefully during the Q&A assess to which extent that answer is satisfactory. So the general approach to the topic is going to be, I'm going to ask why we should even care about this issue, why be motivated to pursue the question, understanding how philosophy might be able to offer some insights to the question itself. I'll then go over how I'm going to be adopting a particular methodology for assessing the different accounts. I'll then give you an overview of the argument I'll be presenting, and then I'll be considering two major positions, externalist and internalist. I'll be defining the terms along the way. And then I'll be advocating for something like a Stoic account of the meaning of life, which will end up being a relational account rather than just purely external or internalistic. And then we'll wrap up and then hopefully have a nice conversation. So why should we even consider the question of the meaning of life? And a nice little philosophy trick is to ask, well, why not consider it? And I think that many people don't fully consider the question about the meaning of life for two particular worries. One that I would classify as being metaphysical in the sense of what actually exists, the nature of reality itself, and epistemological concerns, which are just tied with knowledge, evidence, justification for our particular beliefs. So the metaphysical worry is that there is no meaning of life to discover, so we shouldn't even try to seek an answer to begin with. So if you assume this kind of what's called nihilism, then go on, play hopscotch, do whatever you choose to do. The epistemological concern is that we can never know what the meaning of life actually is, even if there was a meaning. Therefore, since we can't know it, we shouldn't try to even answer the question itself. And I think those are important concerns, but I think that I have some responses to them, namely that even though we can't produce the answer, some answer is still better than no answer at all. And why might that be the case? In large part, it's because we use our own assumptions about what the meaning of life happens to be to pretty much motivate all of our other projects. You know, we pursue a particular profession over others, we pursue a particular personal lifestyle over others. Even our academic pursuits, I would suggest, are all intimately tied to what we assume is the meaning of our own lives. So even if maybe we can't come up with the answer, some answer ought to be given to help inform our everyday practices. So what can philosophy say about this? Well, going back to the famous saying that's attributed to Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. So in Plato's Apology here, Socrates was certainly concerned about what counts as a meaningful life. His general claim was being that we ought to examine life such that we can live a meaningful one. So I would assume that a life worth living is a meaningful life itself, and I would interpret this in saying that if one does not examine life, then one is not living a meaningful life. So then we can ask the fun question of, well, what is actually meant by meaning? And this is actually a big conversation in the philosophy of life literature. And some candidate accounts include that you have an accomplished life, a satisfactory life, a valuable life, a flourishing one, or a pleasurable life. I have my own independent argument for suggesting that we should interpret meaning in the context of the meaning of life as flourishing. And so just for right now, let's just assume that's what's meant by the word meaning itself. So what that means then is that to have a meaningful life, you're then going to have a life in which you're flourishing. And so we can ask later on what that means to actually flourish. And so I presented you with some, philosophical ideas from about 350 BCE, but this is still a contemporary concern of philosophers. So this is just a range of various texts. I'm not going to go through each of them, but this book came out just 2017. This one came out 2018. And so this is still a very, very lively topic. And so philosophers are hopefully providing some useful tools in thinking about the meaning of life itself. And so hopefully this will be a meaningful contribution to itself. So in asking the question, what does it mean then to actually live a meaningful life? It's one that I'm personally concerned with. As Jenny had shared in the introduction, I was fortunate enough to present some of my ideas at the International Conference on Philosophy and Meaning in Life at Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. So some of what I have to say here is similar to what I said there, but since that conference, I've been thinking about it even more in-depthly. So I'd appreciate your feedback on these views. So the methodology I'll be adopting here is trying to find out what it means to have a satisfactory account of the meaning of life. So what I mean by satisfactory is that it's not going to be skeptical, meaning that it's going to assuage us of those metaphysical and epistemological concerns, that it's going to be accessible. We can actually evaluate it to determine if we've appropriately adopted the view. So we have access to the evidence that we're living in accordance with that view. And it's also empirical in the sense that we can observe the effects of having adopted that account. So my general methodological assumptions are that any satisfactory account of the meaningfulness of life ought to at least meet those conditions. So the general approach to the argument is going to be assuming that with regards to the question of what it means to live a meaningful life, we can either adopt an externalist or internalist position, but not both. Okay, so these are going to be what's called mutually exclusive. At least some specific variations of two externalist views, I'll be considering the cosmological and theological account, are unsatisfactory. And then when considering some specific variations of two internalist views, namely existentialism and stoicism, I find the existential view to be unsatisfactory. And I'll be advocating that the Stoic view is somewhat satisfactory. Therefore, we have reasons to further explore and possibly adopt a Stoic view with regards to what it means to live a meaningful life. And later on, I'll explain what it means to be Stoic. It's certainly not emotionless in the way that most people interpret it. So externalism assumes that the meaning or purpose of life comes from outside humanity in general. Meaning would be bestowed by God or some other deity, some metaphysical or cosmological order, or by some other kind of universal principle. Mainly meaning that it's outside of humanity that we're going to find the meaning of life. So the positive externalist account generally comes from a theological perspective. One major theological perspective is called the purposive account, which essentially means that to live a meaningful life, we ought to live in accordance with some plan that's been set forward by God, and that in the fulfillment of that plan, we are then living a meaningful life. This is endorsed by J. Affolter in his Human Nature as God's Purpose article. And I think that's intuitively plausible, that for many of us who are sympathetic to the idea of something like a God existing, that if something is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-good, that we should expect it to be able to create some kind of plan or have an understanding of the plan for our own individual lives. And it would then make intuitive sense that to have a meaningful life is to follow that purpose. But the reasons why I find this approach in general to be unsatisfactory, just to be clear, I'm not making any claims about whether or not God exists. I'm just stating that in trying to understand the meaningfulness of our own lives, that this isn't a particularly satisfactory approach, in large part because we don't have reasons for believing that God does have a plan for us. Even if it is the case that God is all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful, that doesn't tell us that he does in fact have a plan. Okay, so generally we have to make a theological assumption there, but from the purposive account, it doesn't give us additional reasons for accepting that particular attitude. So it doesn't meet the metaphysical concern. The epistemological concern asking us to have evidence to know what that plan might be, but the purposive account, as stated, leaves that wanting, that it requires additional reasons for allowing us to know what God's plan is. Furthermore, it doesn't meet the accessibility concern because without knowing what God's plan is, we cannot know if we're appropriately fulfilling that plan. If we don't have direct access to God, if we don't have evidence to it, then how do we actually know that we've actually lived in accordance with that plan? Okay? I mean, we certainly have faith and we have the assumptions and so on, but what I'm concerned here is about the direct evidence for it. Remember, I'm making an empirical observations here. Then lastly, without knowing what God's plan is, we do not know if the effects we produce are the result of having adopted the account that's been set forward by God himself, or due to some other cause itself. It's this problem of what's called underdetermination, that you can have observed effects, but you don't know what the causes may be. You can give alternative accounts for what would cause for you to have those desired outcomes. So using this criteria of satisfactoriness, it would seem that something like the theological purposive account is not going to be satisfactory. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue working on it, but in terms of the readily available evidence, this one appears to be limited. So we can then shift to thinking about the general cosmos as a whole, rather than saying that it's from God's plan that we derive meaning in our own lives. Instead, think that it's from the cosmos at large that we then have a meaningful life. Unfortunately, I don't think that's too helpful. Instead, it seems to result in a kind of nihilism. So nihilism is generally the view that all value and claims about those values are baseless. So existentialist nihilism is the view that life has no intrinsic meaning or value itself, meaning it's going to have to come from some other source or be created. And then more specifically, cosmological nihilism is a view that a single human being or the entire human species is insignificant, without purpose, and unlikely to change in the totality of existence. So Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism as a Humanism advocates for a kind of existentialist nihilism, although he does come up with a meaning of life, which I'll talk about in a moment. Donald Crosby's The Spectre of the Absurd covers a cosmological nihilism, as does David Story's and David Benatar's The Human Predicament. And so I think that Benatar's account is probably the most interesting, and it's the most recent of these views. So again, this view is that our lives are meaningless when we evaluate it from the cosmological perspective. Now, we can certainly get into discussions about the metaphor, about whether or not there is such a thing as a cosmological perspective, but taking his view on face value, I'll go ahead and assess it accordingly. So he states that there's a crucial perspective, the cosmic one, from which our lives are irredeemably meaningless. And you might ask at this moment, well, how do we know that that's actually his view? Well, he states, my view of cosmic meaning is indeed nihilistic. I think that there is no cosmic meaning. So I'm not committing a straw man here. This is his view. So there seems to be quite a few worries with this. It doesn't really alleviate the metaphysical worry, in large part because it itself is nihilistic. There's nothing to know, so the epistemological worry is still going to be intact. And if there's nothing to know, then how do we know what we're adopting? And then we can't assess the effects that are produced by adopting this view either. So all of the conditions that need to be met for a meaningful an account of the meaningfulness of life are not going to be met. I just think it's boring. So he goes on and states that, there are some interesting parts of his account, such as this one. He states that life is meaningless, but it also has meaning, or more accurately, meanings. There's no such thing as the meaning of life. Many different meanings are possible. One can transcend the self and make a positive mark on the lives of others in myriad ways. These include nurturing and teaching the young, caring for the sick, bringing relief to the suffering, improving society, creating great art or literature, and advancing knowledge. I'm thinking, okay, that sounds intuitively plausible, but how does that work, especially if there is no metaphysical meaning in the genuine sense? So he doesn't really offer too much of a mechanism. So in general, I would ask the follow-up, well, why is it that humans are capable of deriving meaningfulness from their experiences, projects, and relationships when they do not have meaningfulness from the cosmological perspective? So why should we think then that transcending the self, helping others, educating them, and so on, are in fact meaningful projects? In large part, I think the problem lingers for him because he's not offering an account of what it means to be a human person or self. And I believe that we need to give such an account if we're interested in giving an account of what it means to live a meaningful human life. So we have to resolve those metaphysical questions of what is it actually to be human, such that we can live meaningfully human lives. And I believe that we are interested in this. So at this point of the argument, just to summarize where we're at, it seems that two major externalist counts are problematic. So had assumed initially that we can consider either the externalist or internalist position I think I've shown some reasons for thinking that the cosmological and theological variations of externalism are themselves unsatisfactory. So it's with that I turn to internalism. So internalism is the view that meaning or purpose comes from inside people, that humans can give to themselves, and life can be meaningful for persons if they come to see their goals or purposes as inherently valuable or worthwhile. So the first form I'll consider is existentialism, and this is from Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism. He states at length here, man is all the time outside of himself. It is in projecting and losing himself beyond himself that he makes man to exist. And on the other hand, it is by pursuing transcendent aims that he himself is able to exist. Since man is thus self-surpassing and can grasp objects only in relation to his self-surpassing, he is himself the heart and center of his transcendence. Essentially, there is no other universe except the human universe, the universe of human subjectivity. So there's that kind of nihilism right there, that there's no cosmological meaning out there, there's no deity or anything for us to grasp onto in terms of understanding ourselves. He calls this humanism because we remind man that there is no legislator but himself, that he himself, thus abandoned, must decide for himself. Also because we show that it is not by turning back upon himself, but always seeking beyond himself an aim, which is one of liberation or of some particular realization, that man can realize himself as truly human. So it's through our own subjective projects and experiences that then allow for us to find meaningfulness in our own lives, but any attempt to find that meaning outside, beyond humanity, is going to leave us empty-handed. So my general concerns about this is that there's nothing outside humans to give us meaning, so any meaning of life is going to be up to the individual. So that's the way to resolve the metaphysical worry that you are looking in the wrong places by looking to the cosmos or to a god of some kind. Instead, we should be looking to us. So the metaphysical worry seems to be resolved a little bit. Also, the individual person would set their own standards to understand their own meaning. So the epistemological worry seems to be alleviated in some degree. That this is what I define to be the meaningfulness of my life, therefore I set the criteria that needs to be met in order to determine if I have the right evidence. So it's up to me. Well, if it's up to the individual person, then it's also up to them to evaluate how they're living. This is what I set to be the standards of my own life. I'm meeting those standards, therefore I have access to the evidence to know that I am in fact living meaningfully. Then the empirical component would be whatever account of meaning a person chooses to adopt is then going to be assessed on their terms. Okay, so I've adopted this view, I've created it for myself, and I observe the fact that I have in fact adopted the view successfully. One of my concerns though is that this then seems to make the meaning of life arbitrary, being up to that individual. So what I see being a potential problem for the existentialists here is that they could advocate for a view in which just watching Netflix and eating Cheetos is the meaning of your life. So as an individual, I've identified the purpose of my life to watch every single show on Netflix and to eat every single kind of Cheetos. I've set that as a criteria. It's beyond my present self to engage in these sort of activities, so that's what I ought to pursue. You can then use your Netflix account to assess to what extent you've met that particular goal or aim. But it doesn't seem like too interesting of an account. So I think that given that this is a possibility consistent with the existential view, I think that makes it somewhat unsatisfactory for more intuitive reasons. In large part, trying to figure out what it means to be human. Here, the existentialist is treating the human as an individual. And I see this as being an implication of what happens when we treat the human being as an individual. So what we need to really focus on here is trying to figure out what it actually is to be human. So my claim here, is just from observation, is that humans are social creatures. I mean, you guys are here on a Tuesday around lunchtime. Many of you are probably hungry. I know I'm hungry. But yet we engage in social projects for some odd reason. Well, it seems to be that if we're left in isolation, so what happens when we're not social? We're prone to develop various maladaptive traits, various psychoses. So we have empirical evidence for this, that an individual left in solitary confinement is likely to develop social anxiety, PTSD, hallucinations, paranoia. And we have philosophical reasons for thinking about this, going back to Aristotle. Man is by nature a social animal. Society is something that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is self-sufficient as not to need to, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. So the idea there is that if you don't need society, then you're not human. Yeah. So rather than just thinking of us as social, I would go on and say that we're relational creatures, that our very existence is contingent upon the sorts of relationships that we enter into. So if any human is defined in terms of its relations, we need to understand which relationships happen to be the relevant ones. So we can recognize that the individual is situated in the context of some sort of community, and the various communities we have are situated in relationship to all of humanity. Lingering question might be, to what extent do we have a relationship to the cosmos as a whole? So I'll leave that as a question mark. But from the Stoic perspective, various figures such as Musonius Rufus, Seneca the Younger, and Marcus Aurelius maintain that we do in fact have a relationship to the cosmos at whole, and I'll provide specific examples of their ideas in a moment. But they distinguish between two classes of humans, at least according to the historian Diogenes Laertius. And he thought that some humans were either virtuous or non-virtuous. Those who are virtuous have the capacity to fulfill their own purposes or aims, and the non-virtuous ones were those who were not capable of doing so. So in many ways, in trying to figure out what is our purpose, we're then figuring out what it means to actually live meaningfully. Yet our purpose is itself tied to what it actually is to be human. So for Musonius Rufus, he looked at the individual as having an inborn capacity in our souls for proper living, and that the seed of virtue exists in each one of us. It is entirely fitting for us to be good, and indicating that in virtue of being human, we have the capacity for being good. We just have to more so learn how to cultivate it. So then understanding our relationship to various communities in the cosmos states that human beings and other animals on the earth are involved in the constant turning and changing of the universe as are divine beings. So on this view, Musonius Rufus identifies the general cosmos as this constant process in which humans are a participant. The ways that we live are to try to strive and manifest goodness. For Seneca, he states, if we take away all interaction and we renounce the human race, living turned inward only on ourselves, a need for things to do will be the consequence of this kind of isolation. So again, further bolstering that position that in being human, we inherently need communities of some kind. Because when we're removed from those communities, what we end up doing is seeking out those sort of projects. So he goes on and states, here's why we don't just shut ourselves up courageously behind the walls of one city, but set out to have content with the whole world and proclaim that it belongs to us. It's so that we can give a wider playing field to virtue. You are never so shut out of the greater part of life that the better part of it is not left to you itself. So when we put ourselves into isolation, we then diminish our opportunities to further cultivate virtue, which for many of the Stoics, they maintain is the aim of being human. So Marcus Aurelius then goes on and says, with regards to relations, there are three relations. The one to the body which surrounds thee, the second to the divine cause from which all things come to be, and the third to those who live with thee. So we have a relationship to ourselves, our bodies, maintaining those in a healthy way, to the community at large, and then to those who we enter into relationships with. How he understands the nature of the community itself is that we are born for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, so to work in opposition to one another is against nature, and anger or rejection is opposition. So the idea, if you start entering into a state of strife, you're going to come into conflict with yourself, so think about your own internal mental and emotional states. Furthermore, think about the nature of the community, that if the community itself is not working in harmony with each other, then strife, aggravation will arise as well. And just read the news. So what we can do with all this information then is working with the understanding that humans are in fact relational creatures. What it means to be human then is going to be tied to our relations to other humans. That in virtue of being human and our capacity to grow as humans, we have to enter into relationships with other humans. But the Stoics go a little bit further in saying that we have to enter into relationships with our general communities, and they would state the cosmos as well. So for those of you who are maybe concerned about the comments I made with regards to a deity or God, the Stoics actually maintain the view that the cosmos was God. So for the Stoics, the view is that in having a relationship to the cosmos, you're having a relationship with God itself. And so I'll say a little bit more about that later, but I think it's an interesting answer to those theological concerns. The better we are at working cooperatively with others, the more meaningful our lives become, since it is through the flourishing of these relations that our own lives are better able to flourish. Therefore, the meaning of life is to flourish, and the meaning of a human life is to flourish as a human being. So we should also ask, well, what does that actually mean to flourish? Importantly, this is not what's called subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is your own personal assessment of how your life is going. This is a descriptive claim. So you don't want to live in the way of saying, well, I feel good about my life, therefore I'm living well. I think that many of us have been quite mistaken about that at various times. Like, things are going great. It's like, oh, guess those were not going so great. All right, so they're more so concerned in our capacity to flourish regardless of our abilities to recognize as such. So a question that might come up then is, why should we even accept this Stoic account of what it is to be human? Because that's kind of the crux of my argument. So my response is that when we do not work or live in accordance with others, and I would go so far as to say virtuously, we end up being worse off. So here I use the analogy of a sunflower. One, I like sunflowers. And two, I think that we can agree that sunflowers themselves have actual needs that aren't necessarily up to it. So let's imagine that the sunflower has a desire to maybe have more shade and less water. The sunflower itself isn't going to thrive. It's not going to flourish. It's not going to grow well as a sunflower. So in a similar way, we could think that in virtue of being human, we have actual needs. These needs would be entering into virtuous relationships with others, because it's by entering into those kind of relationships that we can actually flourish. So the way I think that this view can be assessed with my initial satisfactory criteria is that the meaning of human life will be tied to the kinds of creatures we are. So rather than trying to look metaphysically out to some kind of cosmic meaning or deified meaning, instead we can ask, well, what is it to actually be human? I think that we would agree that human beings exist, so we can then ask the follow-up question of, well, what is it to actually be human? And that's something that we can actually discover. So in knowing what kinds of creatures we are able to know what is needed for us to flourish. In a similar way, by understanding what a sunflower is, we can understand what's needed for that sunflower to flourish. Therefore, allowing us to understand what it means to live meaningfully. Furthermore, like a sunflower, we can see if it's growing well. You know, its petals are blooming and so on. So in a sense, if we're flourishing, then we know that we're living virtuously. If we're entering into courageous, honest, meaningful relationships, then that means our life is going well. In cases in which we are not flourishing, though, that would be an indicator that our lives are not being lived virtuously. So it meets the first three conditions, and then the last one, being empirical, is that we can observe the extent to which we are flourishing by identifying our abilities to cultivate virtuous habits and relationships. So you can ask yourself, if you believe that entering into physical activity is a virtuous activity, when it becomes a habit to you, such that if you don't engage in that sort of activity, you're uncomfortable, feel like you're lacking something, that's an indicator that you've cultivated that virtuous habit. Furthermore, you can look at the nature of your relationships. Who do you actually surround yourself with? Are these people who encourage you to be more courageous, more honest, live in a more inspired way? And if the answer is yes, then you can observe that you yourself are flourishing, that you've kind of set up the right environment for you to live well. So I believe that given the satisfactory criteria, the Stoic account meets all four conditions. So the implications of this view is that our lives will still have meaning, but it will not be tied to us as individuals at all in the ways that the existentialists would recommend. The meaningfulness of our lives will be tied to the extent to which our relations can flourish, because it's in virtue of our relationships flourishing that we flourish. We should not believe that this meaning would be entirely devoid of meaning when evaluated from the cosmological perspective, in the way that the existentialists and nihilists would suggest, but we should allow for the possibility that from the cosmological perspective, our meaning is tied to our relations, Because this is the sort of creature that humans are. So what I've advocated here is a view that we're relational creatures. But that's a fact about us, not something that we're making up. So it's still a cosmological fact that by entering into these kinds of relationships, we can have meaningful lives. Therefore, we have metaphysical reasons for adopting an internalist, because it's still tied to us as humans, not the cosmos or a god, but it's going to be a relational account of what it means to live a meaningful life. So the summary here, what I've done in this talk, is that I've looked at two different views, externalist or internalist position. I've advocated for thinking that the cosmological and theological positions are unsatisfactory, given my criteria for satisfactoriness. I then evaluated the existential view as being unsatisfactory, in large part because it's focused on individuals. And when we adopt a Stoic view of shifting to a relational account, we can recognize that we might have reasons to further explore and adopt a Stoic view on what it means to live a meaningful life. So, thank you.
The term Stoic, I'm thinking of an integrated kind of life. And so you have a formal definition of Stoic, society. Right? So it's kind of hard for me to kind of interpret, because what I hear you saying is that it's a more integrated of looking at, not just the individual. And so why Stoic?
Because I think it's true, but also why I think it's true is just from observational reasons that in looking at how we live in relationship to others. So when I mean Stoic, I'm referring to the classical Greek and Roman view of Stoicism, not our contemporary usage. So contemporary usage is that if you're Stoic, you don't have any emotions. Right. You're stone cold and so on. But the Stoics were essentially concerned with how to live in a way that ensures that you're not making decisions purely on the basis of emotions, but instead what you've done is cultivated a set of cognitive tools such that when things go wrong, you're not going to be thrown off. You've been kind of mentally prepared. So one of the techniques that they advocate for is called negative visualization. One example of this is that each time that you say goodbye to someone, to imagine it may be the last time that you say goodbye to them altogether, such that when it is in fact the last time that you say goodbye to them, you've kind of already been mentally prepared for it. It's to adopt a kind of biological process called hormesis, which is the idea that when you introduce a small amount of a toxin to a system, the system is able to develop resistance to that sort of toxin. So it's the basic principle of like vaccination. And so I would advocate for Stoicism in large part because we get a metaphysical view and recognizing that in being human, we're part of the general human community. We also get a logic out of it. So the Stoics were responsible for what's called propositional logic, an understanding of how to analyze the relationships of particular sentences. And we also get an ethics, the idea that we ought to live virtuously. So I think that we kind of get this nice, complete philosophical project that I think answers a lot of the concerns with regards to living a meaningful life, where the other views happen to fall short.
So with the Stoic view, there is like a big emphasis on the relationships. Is that purely relationships with other humans, or can it be like environmental relationships?
No, they would actually recommend for environmental relations as well too. So their thinking was that the metaphysical picture that Marcus Aurelius was appealing to is thinking that each person functions as part of a body. The body that we're part of is all of humanity itself, but humanity itself stands in relationship to the entire cosmos. And so the way that the early Stoics viewed the cosmos was as an organism. And so they definitely had more of a biological perspective to understanding ourselves in relationship to nature. Thank you.